Okay. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today I want to talk to some good friends of mine about alternative and renewable sources of energy. They may focus on Ontario, or they may talk about Timbuktu or something. So I don't care, but I do think that we need to talk about alternatives, because if we want to get rid of fossil fuels, what are we going to do instead? Well, there are a lot of options, and these two people know a lot about it. Here in Toronto with me is Angela Bischoff, who is the Outreach Director for Clean Air Alliance, is it?
Ontario Clean Air Alliance.
Yeah, Ontario Clean Air Alliance, good. And in Vancouver is Michael Barnard, who is the director of something called The Future is Electric, TFIE, which is a consulting firm. Exactly this kind of thing. He's promoting, obviously, electric alternatives to fossil fuels. At least one can infer that from the title. So, hello, Angela. Nice to see you.
And you, Meta. Really nice to see you.
And Michael, hi.
Meta, a pleasure as always, and happy birthday! You've changed a year since we last spoke.
Yeah, well, I'm 90, and I'm just it gets better every year. So,
on that note, a quick shout out to my mom, Jean Bernard, who also just turned 90.
Oh, congratulations, Jean Bernard! Excellent. All right, so we're going to talk about energy today, and both of you have a thing or two to say on that subject. Who wants to go first?
Oh, why don't I frame it? Because
Sure.
I'm an Ontario boy as much as I'm anything, even though I live in Vancouver. Like, I've lived in Moosonee, Kapuskasing, North Bay, and Toronto. And Toronto is actually one of my home cities. I moved there twice. I had a strong focus on Ontario's energy transition because I was focused on the pushback against wind energy in the early 2000s. And I've spent a lot of time writing and publishing on Ontario's excellent choice to get rid of coal, something they did which saved 37 million tons of CO2 a year. There was enormously good work done under the McGuinty government that was perpetuated under the Wynne government. And now, unfortunately, we're into a different administration, which is making different choices and in many ways regressing. So the case study, the microcosm of Ontario in the global energy space, has got a lot of lessons to teach us. And Angela, you spend all your time in Ontario Clean Air Alliance, so these are near and dear to your heart. So that's kind of where I want to focus, but they're universal lessons from Ontario.
And maybe I could just add that the coal phase out in Ontario, that was actually spawned by grassroots activism. It was our initial campaign, the Clean Air Alliance. We formed in 1997 to call for 100% coal plant phase out. It took 17 years. The McGuinty government, followed by the Wynne government, actually made it happen, brought in green energy at the same time as also rebuilding our aging nuclear infrastructure. So, yeah, grassroots activism can really shift public policy dramatically, as we saw in Ontario. And now the rest of the world is following on Ontario's lead in phasing out coal. So that's a super success story. But now we have a very different story with the Conservative government that was elected 2 years ago. They immediately canceled 60% of the funding for the conservation programs, which were very successful. The previous Wynne government had reduced, Wynne and McGuinty government had reduced electrical demand in the province by 10%, which is a dramatic, that's our lowest cost way to reduce electricity bills, is by reducing the amount of supply that we have to produce. And it's our cheapest. It's only on average 2 cents a kilowatt hour to reduce demand. So the Wynne government had very successfully reduced demand dramatically, as they had also invested in wind and solar energy, spawning a whole renewable energy industry in this province, such that we have more wind and solar in Ontario than any other province in Canada. But there were mistakes done in producing that green energy.
Hold on. You said something I want to make sure I really heard. Ontario has more wind and solar energy than any Than what?
Any other province in Canada.
Well, is that because we're the biggest and we have more of everything, or are we really doing a better job of leadership?
We definitely did a better job of leadership, and we put lots of money into spawning a new industry. But in the process, we gained lots of opposition, which is what Mike did a lot of research on. So one of the things that we did wrong was we took away the veto power of municipalities to say no to these large infrastructure projects, wind in particular. So communities got their backs up and started fighting it. And that is what brought to the fore the Conservative government, because they ran the last two elections opposing the Green Energy Act and opposing the installation of wind and solar around the province because communities fought it. So it was very instrumental. The new government came in, the Ford government came in, they canceled 758 renewable energy projects that had already been signed by the wind government. They even canceled some large projects that were already built at huge economic consequence to the province, and they reduced the energy conservation budget by 60% and doubled down on not only rebuilding 10 of our aging nuclear reactors, which are our most expensive way to meet our electricity needs. They canceled negotiations with Quebec, which the previous government was involved with negotiating for low-cost renewable Quebec water power and storage imports, and they moved forward with building a new GTA small modular reactor at Darlington. So they completely transformed the direction. Oh, and they bought up 3 old gas plants, and they're ramping up gas-fired electrical generation 500%. In a climate era when the whole world is phasing out gas power, the Ford government is ramping up gas. So the Ford government is moving to nuclear and gas and phasing out the renewables and the conservation programs. It's just insane, which is exactly why we have to defeat the Conservative government in the next election, because their electricity policy is just like insane and not in step at all with the rest of the world, which is going renewable, which Mike can really address how the whole world is moving to a renewable future. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IEA, says that 95% of new electrical supply in the next 5 years will come from renewable power. So the whole world is going renewable. Meanwhile, Ontario and Canada are investing in SMR, small modular nuclear reactors, a new technology which is untested, and Mike can refer to that, and very expensive. Mm-hmm. And Ontario in particular is ramping up gas and rebuilding our aging nuclear reactors. It's insane.
Hence the reason I felt we should talk with us, because we're both fairly passionate about this subject. You know, as Ontario getting it right and getting it wrong has some strong lessons. To pull this apart, though, Ontario is this really interesting microcosm because they still have this idea in the conservative mindset of energy independence, that concept that trading energy across jurisdictional boundaries is bad. They explicitly in their call out say in 2016, they exported 17.6 terawatt hours from their nuclear reactors at extremely low prices. That's due to something that comes with a lot of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, especially the CANDU reactors, technology, doesn't follow load very well. It doesn't go up and down quickly. Like you can turn a gas plant on pretty quickly, you can turn it off pretty quickly. You can turn a wind turbine, you can feather wind turbines, you can turn off solar panels, but you've got to be really cautious about changing how much you're using nuclear reactors. And because Ontario has 55% of their demand met from nuclear reactors, Ontario's usually multiple times a year, multiple times a month even, in a position of surplus baseload generation. The surplus baseload generation is exactly what it sounds like. We've got too much inflexible supply. Oh, and the demand has dropped below that. So we've got to get rid of that electricity somewhere. We can't easily turn down Ontario's nuclear reactor fleet. So in many cases, they've been paying other jurisdictions like New York to take the electricity So they'll pay them millions of dollars to take dozens or hundreds of megawatt hours of electricity, because New York State has to, or Pennsylvania has to turn off generation there. And so it's disruptive to their planning. And this is because Ontario has too much. Now, there's some interesting corollaries to this as well. One of the big things you hear about renewables is, well, they require a lot of storage, and storage is bad. It's expensive. But we have 170 gigawatts of pumped hydro storage globally, and Ontario actually has a lot of pumped hydro storage because they shut down the wind energy and the solars, because they have this nuclear problem. It's too much nuclear. I don't mind 40%. That's the number I peg it at for Ontario. And you and I can leave off our different opinions on nuclear. But if it was just down at 40%, they'd have fewer problems. But what they've done is they've actually expanded a former 175 megawatt pumped hydro facility at Niagara into a 600 megawatt, 4.8 gigawatt hour pumped hydro facility, specifically to deal with giving nuclear something to do at night, and not have to pay neighboring jurisdictions as much money. They've, what used to be TransCanada, the pipeline and company, is now TC Energy, and they're contracted to build a pumped hydro facility on the shores of Georgian Bay in Meaford. It's a 1 gigawatt facility. That 1 gigawatt is how much electricity it can deliver into the grid at one time. It's like a nuclear plant per hour. And I don't know exactly how many hours it'll last, probably 8 or 12. So it's like 10 or 12 gigawatt hours of pumped hydro storage it's proceeding. And there's some really interesting analogies there, which we'll get into as well, because the first irony is Ontario is building a lot of grid storage to deal with nuclear, just as has happened everywhere there's nuclear globally. The vast majority of grid storage that's been built to date, 170 gigawatts, was built for nuclear. And so now they're building more pumped hydro, more grid storage to deal with nuclear, and they're paying people to build, like in Sarnia, there's this, I think it's a 100 megawatt hour battery facility behind the meter in a petroleum or chemical refinery plant that I'm aware of, that's there because Ontario Hydro or Hydro One actually make the price points, make it worth private organizations building their own massive storage behind the meter. So Ontario is actually an epicenter of storage.
Excuse me, what do you
renewables.
mean behind the meter?
The pumped hydro at Niagara and in Meaford is in front of the meter, which is to say it's on the grid. But when you get to a facility like your home, like your condo building has a meter. Behind the meter means inside the building. So if you had a battery inside your home, it would be behind the meter.
Oh.
Right. And so right now, there's actually behind the meter storage is grid storage is economically viable in Ontario and very few other jurisdictions in the world, because we have this problem and because demand management requires that people turn down their demand or turn up their demand at different times of day. So it makes it worthwhile.
So they've worked against themselves by setting up a situation where people can cheat them. Is that?
Well, it's not cheating them. It's they've created a situation where
if they want to have everything metered, so we pay and they give us ways of avoiding that. That's what I mean.
Yeah, but they have to do that because their generation is inflexible. And they're building more gas plants for exactly the same reason. In a post-industrial economy, the demand is much spikier than in an industrialized economy. Nuclear baseload is good for industrialized economies, but post-industrial economies, it goes like this. And so they have to have this instant-on peakers, which is why they're building all this new gas generation.
Post-industrial economy is spikier. Why? What's happening?
We have less 24/7 manufacturing, which is providing heavy demand loads for electricity on the grid. As such, the consumer and office building loads, which vary more substantially over the day, start to dominate the load balance.
Okay. So because they don't know what time of day I'm going to check my email and turn on my computer or off, or that's contributing to this spikiness.
Well, it's more that instead of having this big bulk of demand that's flat with some spikiness, now they have a lot less base demand with a lot more spikiness of other sources. And so they have to address that flexibility. That's why baseload generation is an archaic comment on modern grids. It's been replaced by flexibility as the primary metric as a primary and dominant metric for grid generation. And wind and solar are flexible. Nuclear, because of economic and technical requirements, depending upon the nuclear technology, is more inflexible.
Fascinating. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Angela, sorry.
Let me add. So you're talking about storage, and like the TC Energy storage, pumped storage project you're talking about is, I think it was like, it was almost 100 times more expensive than using storage from Quebec. So what we're advocating for,
transmission from Quebec,
not only transmission but also storage. So, and we've been talking about this for years, but the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, very credible, they came out with a study recently that supported what we've been saying, which is that the Quebec hydro reservoirs are the Northeast United States, but also Ontario's lowest cost source of storage.
Absolutely.
And they're 97% less expensive than that TC Energy pumped storage proposal that we're all going to have to pay for to back up Bruce Power's project, Bruce Power's nuclear power. But so what that means is that wind and solar in Ontario, and when we have surplus wind and solar in Ontario, we can export that to Quebec to keep the lights on in Montreal. And when our wind and solar is below average, Quebec can release the hydro reservoirs, the water there to export more electricity to Ontario. So it's a perfect complement. The Quebec hydro reservoirs, not only can we buy lots of surplus power from them because they have tons of surplus power. The James Bay dams were dammed decades ago. The goal of Hydro-Quebec at the time was to be the generation provider for all of the Northeast United States. And they haven't been successful at building transmission lines from Quebec into the Northeast US states because of opposition from environmental.
They have not been as successful. They do have,
right.
They've got some in the 80s, early 80s that are live and running electricity down to New York. And they have a new one that's going through. And HVDC is a subject I want to touch on because this gets into exactly the reasons we're starting to see. So, but Angela is exactly right. MIT is exactly right. We're seeing this in Northern Europe as well. This is part of the universal story. For continents where you have far northern dams, which are massive, they can be used as passive storage. When I say passive storage, you have pumped hydro, like Meaford and Niagara, where you actually pump water uphill. Passive, you just have this big dam and the rain cycle, the water cycle just fills it for you. And you release it as you need it, right? And so nature fills up the storage for us instead of us having to fill up the storage. And it is cheaper. All you need is transmission to get stuff out. You broaden the scale. And that's why I started with energy independence is a really bad idea because Ontario's fixation on generating everything it needs within its borders and having limited connections is exactly the wrong thing to do in a modern grid.
And it's also BS because we get all our natural gas from Western Canada, from Pennsylvania. We get all our uranium from Saskatchewan. So we're already completely dependent on other jurisdictions. There's no reason why we couldn't get water power from Quebec. The beautiful thing is we've already got the transmission grid built between the two provinces. We're already importing some and we can already import quite a bit more. And with very small investments, like for an $80 million upgrade around the Toronto transmission corridor, we could get another 2,000 megawatts of power. And that is, when you consider that the Darlington reactors Or even the Darlington rebuild project is $13 billion. And
Well,
that's
I want to really draw this out here because you said two numbers, and I want to give everybody real context to this. 80 million for 2 gigawatts of capacity from transmission, or 13 billion for a lot for
about 3 gigawatt, like it's
about 3 gigawatts. The
yeah.
numbers are staggering. The transmission connections to Quebec, and we should also be doing it the other way, by the way. We should be going to Manitoba. Manitoba also has massive hydropower, and they also would happily ship some of that to Ontario. We should be going both directions. From a Canadian perspective, the energy corridor we need across Canada is a high voltage direct current line, big ones going all the way coast to coast. That should be our new Golden Spike project, because then every province can share all the electricity it has. If it has surplus, it can flow east and west. If it has needs, it can suck them in, right? This is all very viable and much, much cheaper than trying to maintain energy independence in Ontario at a great expense. So,
And it's also renewable water power. I mean, nobody's suggesting building more dams.
nope.
We have plenty of water power currently in the country that could be powering much more of our electrical supply, as could wind and solar. That's the future, not only Canada, but around the
Yep.
world. And there's no reason for us to be ramping up gas, ramping up tar sands, offshore drilling. The future is renewable. The world is doing that, and Canada is a little bit out of step here, especially the federal government. What's with the federal government investing potentially billions of dollars, currently 150 million so far, in exploring this potential future down the road, at least a decade away, super high technology PowerPoint reactors, small modular nuclear reactors. Why would we be going there when the climate crisis is now? Scientists say we need to transform our economies now to renewable economy. We can roll out wind and solar, huge wind and solar projects in 1, 2, 3 years. It's proven. Why are we soaking millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, and resources and expertise in these new project, in this new potential technology, which the rest of the world is essentially saying no to? Why is Canada diving into this? Mike, you should address the SMR issue, please.
Well, so there's 3 or 4 threads that pull through this. The first is conservative governments kicking climate action down the road. They can claim that they are doing climate action. Yes, we accept climate change. And we're going to do that with small modular reactors, which won't be commercially available until 2030 at the earliest. When we have to start, if ever. I believe that some of them will get to market, but Angela referred to the publication I did on SMRs, which is now being accepted into a German textbook, by the way. Apparently it's impressing people around the world, which is kind of cool. The small modular reactor, there's multiple problems. The first problem is we had small reactors at the beginning of the nuclear age. They were uneconomic. For something like a thermal generation unit, like coal or nuclear, you need to make it bigger, up to closer to a gigawatt of capacity before the economics of piping steam and all those types of things turn into something that's viable at a reasonable price point. So we know this about nuclear. We knew this in the 1960s when prices of nuclear generation plummeted because we made them gigawatt scale technologies. So why are we ignoring that? Don't know. Statement 2, they're going to manufacture them in plants and then ship them to locations to install, like heating and air conditioning units. Except that you need actually hundreds of them, of a single thing, to be built to achieve economies of scale. And I think I counted 18 different competitive technologies in the jurisdictions that are attempting to do this. Many of them, there's 5 or 6 in the United States and 2 in Canada alone. Nobody's going to achieve economies of scale with this thing. Third, security costs stay the same. They still have radioactive material. It's still, terrorist, dirty bomb, wet dreams. So we're going to need to do the same overlapping shells of security: international, national, provincial, municipal, site, and then within the site, there's actually 5 different levels, and most of that security is paid for by taxpayers. So there's lots of subsidies there, and it's still nuclear waste. We're still going to be, for every gigawatt of capacity we put in, we're going to be paying $1 billion and taking 100 years to decommission it. So SMRs just don't make sense, and they certainly don't make sense to put in small communities. Do you really want a terrorist wet dream beside Inuvik or beside Meaford? No. So small modular reactors are a way for people within the nuclear industry who have just had basically the worst 15 years of their industry's career, with Fukushima, with government after government saying we're getting out of nuclear, with nuclear generation being shut down globally, except for China and a little bit in Russia. Right? China's the only one that's actually got any build program that's actually achieving any significant results. They sit there and say SMRs are the answer. This is the way we'll keep ourselves occupied. But they come with well-funded industries with political connections, especially in Ontario, that will lobby governments, and they will do lots of PR campaigns, much better funded campaigns than Angela probably can scrape up. She's deals with this on a daily basis as a public service organization, as she does. She knows how much funding they have versus how much she has.
Okay, what arguments do they give? Because somebody has to be convinced by them.
The first is they say, well, we can't build it wind and solar because we need lots of storage. Oh, but what about this 1.6 gigawatts of storage you're building for nuclear? So fail 1. 2, we can't transmit electricity long distances. Oh, wait, James Bay is sending electricity 1,000 kilometers to New York State today. And now we've got high voltage direct current, which can throw much more electricity with much lower resistance at much lower costs today. And we're actually already have transmission built between continents. Africa is shipping electricity across the Bosphorus Strait into Europe. And there's a new thing going in Morocco. It's a massive wind and solar and storage farm with a proposed high voltage direct current underwater thing to the UK. They were proposing something similar in Australia when they've pivoted to hydrogen, because hydrogen is hot right now, where they're going to put this massive solar farm in Singapore or in Australia and run an HVDC cable along the Indonesian islands up to Singapore, which is a high demand space. It's going to be, 3,800 kilometers. Right now, we actually have 3,400 kilometer HVDC transmission lines working today. And we have them running underwater, we have them running between countries, we have them running between continents. So saying that transmission doesn't work doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. They say that they're too expensive. Nuclear is 3 to 5 times more expensive per delivered megawatt hour than wind or solar. They say that they are bad for grid reliability. Well, Denmark and Germany have high penetrations of wind and solar. Germany is at 46% from renewables, and frequently gets over 100% of its hourly demand from renewables today. That's a lot. Denmark is higher, frequently gets 140% of demand from wind energy alone, which means it sends its excess electricity south. They have grid reliabilities of under 15 minutes of outages per customer per year. These are high penetrations of renewables on incredibly reliable grids. So grid reliability is also a false statement. So all the major things that I put up, those 4 things that I put up, don't bear scrutiny in empirical reality. Angela, what would you add to that? What nuances or additional points would you make?
It really it makes no economic or environmental sense why the provincial government would want to invest in new nuclear or even rebuilding our existing nuclear infrastructure when wind, water, and solar are 3 times less expensive. So we're talking billions and billions of dollars. So there's no economic sense. There's just, political, like the conservative government was elected on the promise to kill renewable energy and kill the Green Energy Act, and that's what they're elected on. So it's just, we call it the nuclear lobby. They're like, as Mike so expertly explained, they're just trying to preserve their industry and their jobs, and they're going out of business. The previous Harper government essentially gutted the nuclear program by selling AECL, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, all the infrastructure to SNC-Lavalin, and killed the new nuclear program, which Ontario wanted to build some new nukes at Darlington. So they're, like Mike said, around the world they're tanking, and they see Canada, because Canada, the federal government has supported the Canadian nuclear industry since the 50s. I mean, the reason for being Canada's nuclear program, starting in the 40s, from uranium mining right through to nuclear uh, production, was to produce plutonium and enriched uranium for the US nuclear bomb programs. And we did that until the late 60s. And then, then we got into what we called the peaceful atom, where we started using that waste heat to boil water to generate steam and electricity. And so, there's questions like the new SMR program that the federal government is investing. It's almost all American and UK private industry that's coming to Canada to start up with federal tax dollars, to start up these SMR companies, to try to commercialize them on the market, to export them around the world. And guess what? All these US and UK companies are almost exclusively connected to the military industry. So they have different arms of their companies. So, it begs the question, what's the connection with the military around the world, or in particular UK and the US? Why would Canada want to enable it? Are we just, we want to be part of the international high-tech game. We've always been part of it. We were in the big league since the 40s with US and UK. We were part of the Manhattan Project. We were always part of this league, and we want to stay there. And so the SMR industry is trying to set up shop at Chalk River, Ontario, where they're going to have like demonstration projects, got lots of federal tax dollars, and then now 4 provinces are buying in, including Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and New Brunswick, I believe. They all want to be part of the SMR game, and they're committing tax dollars both provincially and expecting the feds to kick in. And it's just maintaining the status quo, continuing their jobs and industry. I don't know.
Could I throw in another question about an argument that I have heard from friends that I treasure, but with whom I disagree almost viscerally? And that is, I have a lot of friends who believe that we're going to have to cut back and simplify our living, and we cannot consume as much, and we cannot live as high on the hog as we have, and we cannot produce the amount of goods that we have because of the shortage of natural resources that we're depleting very rapidly. So everybody's going to have to go back to living very, very simply and consuming less. And they put on shows, and I have a dear friend whom I will not name here because I don't want to lose her friendship. And that is somebody who puts on shows arguing that it's not going to be possible to increase renewable resources, energy sources like wind and power, et cetera, because there's simply not enough raw materials to go around to doing it. So I don't know why they think it'll be easier to put in small modular reactors or any other alternative. In fact, I'm not sure they would even argue for that. I think they would say, well, we're just going to have to do with less electricity and less energy. So let's go back to living in a hovel and so on. So, but the argument there is that there simply isn't enough material available to allow the kind of expansion of renewable energy production that you guys are calling for. So, answer me.
I'll start, and Angela can chime in afterwards. I believe the expression is that that's bullshit. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're talking about from a human nature perspective, and they don't know what they're talking about from a materials and minerals availability perspective. From a human nature perspective, if they want to wear hair shirts, they can. But guess what? Any solution which requires 8 billion people to change substantially from being the human beings that we are today, with all of our messy semi-rationality, desire for status, desire for wealth, desire for our families to be happy and cared for, it's not going to happen. So I'm pleased that these people think that they're going to somehow magically change every human everywhere, but it doesn't pass the most minute beginning of a sniff test. So that's statement one. Statement two, from a minerals perspective, right now we mine 500 billion tons of gravel, and I think it's 12 billion tons of limestone in order to make cement globally. Cement is actually something that's used in wind turbine bases. Well, guess what? We're pivoting to mass timber construction, where we can put up to, in Canada, the limit is 12 stories for buildings made out of laminated beams. So that last a long time, embody carbon as opposed to require carbon. And we up to 12 stories. It's 16 stories, I think, in Sweden. They're ahead of us slightly, but BC went 12, Ontario last year went 12. So across Canada, we've got this ability to change that up. I'm peripherally engaged with a 6-story building out near Trout Lake in Vancouver, just that away, said he, pointing in a direction that no one can tell. We're doing this now, so we're transitioning. So one thing is we are using materials much more efficiently than we used to. We do not have a shortage of materials, and we do not have a shortage of industrial materials. What we can do is change some of the stuff about how we use them, but that doesn't mean human beings have to change. We don't have to live in hovels. I always like to look at the example of Tesla cars, right? Tesla cars are insanely desirable cars. They use about the same amount of materials as normal internal combustion cars. And the batteries are highly recyclable. 80% of the lithium that goes into a battery can be recycled. How is it that we can have a billion cars, internal combustion cars, but not a billion electric cars? So once again, there's a distinct mismatch between the assertions. What they have is an eco-utopian perspective that leads them to a confirmation bias where they reject the reality of what our global economy can do, how big the earth is. We are pond scum on a massive ball of minerals. All the cities in the world, all the urban infrastructure in the world covers less than 2% of the land space of the world. We have lots of room. So I just reject those arguments entirely from the perspective of human nature and physical reality. They don't know what they're talking about, and we should just stop talking about them. Angela, if you'd like to put a spike in that one so we can turn back to energy in Ontario, please go ahead.
That was a really good answer. I appreciate that, Mike. I think we are a very decadent culture, and I think we can do more with less. And, Ontario, for example, reduced our demand by 10%. Nobody knew that. It was just industrial improvements in insulation and windows. We're a very smart culture and economy, and we'll come up with way smarter ways so that we don't have to build another billion electric cars, that we can transport ourselves differently, we can design our cities differently. And I'm very optimistic that we can travel this transition without having to go back to horse and buggy and, all the things that those
But
people.
I'm looking forward to the
Great.
driverless electric cars and replacing all of the privately owned cars.
Sure, some people will want
I
that.
have plans for what to do with those parking lots. I want forests in our cities
Beautiful.
and so on. So I'm really, I think it's a great thing that we're getting close to the point where we can just call a taxi and it'll be here within 1 minute. And apparently it'll cost much less because it'll be driverless and electric. So the roads apparently will be full, but the parking lots will be empty and we can do other things with them. And I'm diverting this conversation.
Absolutely. So pivoting back, let's talk about some things which are reality and they're human nature.
Okay.
So let's talk about Meaford, the pumped hydro facility that TC Energy is being contracted to build in Meaford, $1 billion. And Angela, I actually think we should build it, but because it's useful to have pumped hydro storage for renewables in every province anyway. So I don't mind them building it. I just think I think it's just a laughable example of why they are talking out of two sides of their face. But that one has had 4 petitions from the local community, and the Save the Georgian Bay Society is all over that, and they are fighting tooth and nail to prevent it. They're worried about turbidity in the water. They're worried about destruction of, it's like a big pond on top of a hill, and then there's going to have intakes down on Georgian Bay. And what about the fish? These are all NIMBY reactions by people who who don't actually live there. These are wealthy Torontonians who have places in rural places they do not want to change. And as we look across Ontario, I look at Prince Edward County. This was the same reaction. The pushback in Prince Edward County to wind energy was from affluent Torontonians and others who had vacation and retirement properties in the county. Affluent, part-time resident, connected, used to getting their own way, and knows how to lobby for what they want. That's a lot of rich people who take vacation and retirement properties in rural areas and then don't want them to change. And that gets to the transmission problem. Angela talked about this. They couldn't get people to agree to transmission going through their things. That's another NIMBY problem. And then the electromagnetic spectrum frequency BS, that health nonsense comes in, and all the health quacks come in and terrify communities. And we have to, during this transition, spend a lot more time communicating in savvy ways around specific projects to gain sufficient support. 3 of 5 councillors who have to approve the stuff based upon giving them local value, doing a bunch of this stuff in order for these projects to get through. And we're not doing enough of that. It's a communication problem and it's a PR effort. The people who are opposing it are winning the PR battle, in part because it's much easier to sell FUD than it is to sell hope. So
Okay, let me add to that. So that's a good segue because I wanted to talk a bit about opposition to nuclear in Ontario, because all we ever hear is that this is what the province is doing and there's no public conversation about it. The public doesn't even know that there's a new SMR being planned for Darlington, which is in the GTA. The public does not know that we have existing right now 12 nuclear reactors in the GTA, 10 of which are pumping out electricity in the GTA, surrounded by millions of people. They would never get permission to even build today. Like the Pickering nuclear station with 8 reactors is only 30 kilometers from downtown Toronto. Like Meta is going, really? It's bizarre.
1.4 kilometers from a friend's townhome.
Yeah. Fair enough. So we just this past week and did a poll of 1,500 people. So we hired a pollster to see what people's thoughts were about a new GTA reactor, because OPG, Ontario Power Generation, or the provincial government wants to build yet another nuclear reactor in the GTA at the Darlington station. In addition to rebuilding all 4 reactors at Darlington, they want to build another reactor.
And running into problems of Bruce Nuclear Yeah, three of the reactors at Bruce Nuclear are really having trouble. They're going to be vastly over budget and schedule for the rebuild. So
Bruce or Darlington?
Bruce.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and it's really hard to, like, OPG, or the provincial utility, Ontario Power Generation, they're not doing any public education, letting people know that they're rebuilding the reactor. Like, people are unaware of it. So it's hard for us to build when the public doesn't know about it, and partly because the media doesn't really explore nuclear issues in Ontario because they get lots of funding from the nuclear industry. The nuclear industry is buying full page ads all the time just promoting how good they are and medical isotopes, and they're saving lives, and they're pumping lots of money into the local communities. So there's no opposition within the local communities. Anyways, this poll,
Which is important. That's because NIMBYs are local. And existing nuclear sites already have social license because they already exist.
right. And so they're supportive. So we did a poll around the whole GTA region of 1,500 residents. And what we found was, so one of the question was, if there was lower cost renewable options like wind, water, solar, conservation, would you support a new nuclear reactor being built, or would you prefer the alternatives? And the NDP, 90 people who identified as NDP, because you're always asking that question, that's the first question. People who identified as NDP supporters, 97% said wind, water, solar, conservation rather than new nuclear. Green parties, 98%. Liberals, 93%. Guess what the PCs were? So conservative voters,
27.
1 in 5 said we want wind, water, and solar rather than nuclear. Like, the 4 out of 5 still said they want nuclear power. So it really breaks down from parties. Like, Greens, Liberals, NDP are almost 100% anti-nuclear if there are lower cost renewable alternatives. The Conservatives still want Okay, one more question, which I think is really relevant, is we don't have a solution for nuclear waste in Ontario yet. The best the government can come, both federally and provincially, the best they can come up with is burying our nuclear waste in a deep geologic repository 600 meters below the surface of the earth.
To be clear, burying it in a hole means burying it in specific containers that are very neutral, that are spaced so that they don't have thermal load and emissions challenges, and monitored, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for 10,000 years.
Well, or the nuclear industry says 1,000,000 years. It has to be isolated from the environment for 1,000,000 years. This is what they're saying. And it's like, okay, so there have been 3 DGRs, deep geologic repositories, around the world so far to date that have buried nuclear waste, not even high level, buried it, and all 3 have failed. One of them in Germany, they're actually pulling the waste back up. So, but nevertheless, this is what the nuclear industry says. They want to dump it in a hole, cover it with concrete, and abandon it forever. That's their proposal. So they're working on that. So we said, until, like, right now, all the nuclear waste is still stored on site of all the nuclear sites. And we said, okay, until there's a permanent safe storage for the nuclear waste, because they just have these proposals. Until there's a permanent safe storage, do you think we should be producing more nuclear waste? And once again, 100%, almost, between 95 and 100% of Liberals, NDPs, and Green Party says, of course we shouldn't be producing more nuclear waste if we have no permanent solution for the storage. And even half of the Conservatives said, we should not be producing more nuclear waste or building new nuclear reactors until we have a solution for the waste. And the industry doesn't, but they've got this big PR campaign across Canada that they're going to bury it in a hole, which we don't believe is ever going to happen. We don't believe it's a real solution.
They have a bad answer for that too. Molten salt reactors, which will actually use the waste, and so the non-existent technology.
And if that were to work, why are they burying it in a hole? They obviously know it's not going to work, and they don't even want to bury it in a hole. It's just a PR problem for them. People don't support nuclear as long as we don't have a solution for the waste. Why is it that we don't have why are we producing more? It's just
once again, local communities where there is a nuclear reactor today, the nuclear reactor has social license because we disregard risks of things we're familiar with. What if, just imagine this for a minute. Suppose the entire society ran on wind, water, solar. We had heat pumps and we had induction stovetops. And somebody said to you, what we really think is we found this stuff called natural gas. And it's a toxic substance which would kill you if you breathed in it. But it burns and it creates heat. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a distribution network under all the homes and schools. And we're going to pump it into buildings. And in the building, we're going to wire it up to hot water heaters and to gas furnaces and to stoves. And you're going to burn this natural gas inside your home. And it's going to create carbon monoxide. It's going to create CO2. It's going to create nitrous oxide, so indoor air pollution. And occasionally it's going to explode. Are you up for that? If it wasn't for the existing use of natural gas or coal or nuclear,
right?
Today,
we would never build it today. It would never
even begin because they're grandfathered in terms of human behavior. It's cognitive psychology again. Our risks of the unknown are much worse than our perception of risks for the known. What they did is they've done a lot of before and after studies of communities where there are wind farms, right? And people fear the wind farm before they arrive, and then they're part of the landscape, except for the 1 or 2% who just persist in being, oh, I blame something on it. I was hypertense and I couldn't sleep before because I'm fat and I sleep with a fat person who snores, but it's the wind turbine's fault because it sticks up, right? And so once again, cognitive psychology comes into play. And this gets back to creating campaigns that are specific to individual projects to create a majority, not 100%, approval. I've got a couple of buddies down in the States who spend all their time in this. I spent a lot of time in this on global projects in the early 2000s. I worked stuff I was doing was published, and I was engaged in, of all things, a project in Tasmania on King Island, which does great cheese from King Island. And they had choice between 2 golf courses or this really awesome wind farm, which would feed clean electricity from these massive trade winds down to New Zealand and up to Australia, right? Just stunning stuff, but got shot down by wind farms or shot down by golf courses. Like these people are 50 kilometers from the mainland. Who the heck's going to fly out there to play golf?
Meanwhile, the whole world now, like 20 years ago, there was this massive opposition to green energy, and it was expensive and there were uncertainties. But now the world is because of economies of scale, the price is down, the success rate is up, the technology has improved so dramatically. Now it makes absolutely no sense to be investing in fossil fuels
But NIMBYs still exist, and we have to deal with the NIMBYism. More
right.
so now than before.
We're transitioning now.
And that meta is the communities like Bruce, around the Bruce nuclear plant, which have a lot of people working in the plant and have a lot of secondary value. We have to deal with that just as we have to deal with coal workers. We have to help them transition to the modern economy, and we have to give them a clear path forward so they don't cling to the past. The second thing we have to do is where there is change going in, wind turbine, wind farms, solar farms, transmission, pumped hydro, we have to invest locally in programs to target those communities and help them see the benefits and get them the benefits. Those are the only 2 things that are real out of all of this.
There's an editorial in the Globe and Mail about how the Ford government was able to legally undo everything that the city council plans that the city council of Toronto had, because cities do not have any political autonomy, and therefore the province can make all the decisions. So what I'm wondering is, it seems to me, and I don't know whether this is true, I should know, that the main opposition to a lot of these renewable plans come from rural areas and suburban areas where, and that's why Ford wins, but the city districts are less likely to support nuclear or older technologies. Is this partly a matter of changing the legal constituencies so that municipal areas have more to say than they do now? Is this partly a political design problem?
It is a problem around the world. The constitutions of most countries were built when urban areas represented 5 to 10% of the population, as was the case with the British North American Act and the Constitution which followed it. The wealth, the people who lived in cities were rentiers. There were people who were titled and had land in urban areas, and that was the source of their wealth. Now it's completely inverted, but political systems around the world still have inverted power so that it is not, it comes from the federal to the subnational, and then the municipalities are all second-class citizens. I've written a manifesto on it, and it's also an insanely hard problem, because you actually have to open up all the constitutions, including the Canadian Constitution, and gain political support across the board, typically a supermajority. It won't happen as long as the NDP and the Liberals at the federal level persist in foolishly being separate parties, as one example.
Okay. Because I've had some viewing of the situation in the US, and it's really clear that the Republicans are in power wherever they are because of the excess political influence that rural voters have, and that if you made it more democratic so that the where people are really concentrated in cities, that they get more representation, then and that's certainly clear in the US. I'm just not sure whether it's as true in Canada, and whether that is a factor that really explains the possibility that reactionary political factors or people groups can keep winning the day when it comes to fights over the types of energy we want to have.
It's a short-term thing in Canada. I'll be very clear on this. Under Harper's watch, I'll give him credit for not blocking this, efforts to move to a redistricting of all ridings in Canada based on population by an independent commission was enacted. And now every time there's a census, Canada's electoral districts get redrawn, which means that in the densest area code in Canada, now I'm getting closer to parity in terms of my vote counting with people in rural areas. And so as urbanization continues, and COVID was a blip, but it didn't send people back to the middle of nowhere. It didn't increase the population of tiny towns. Tiny towns are dying. Rural areas are hollowing out because automation of agriculture, automation of resource extraction has diminished the number of people that can have any useful jobs out there, which means that Prince Edward County class places, which are really, really beautiful and quaint, can have tourist and retirement economies, but they don't have any resource economies to speak of. And so as we think about it,
it's time, we're overdue. And I'd love to keep this going. This conversation is very interesting to me.
Well, bring me back with Doug. Bring me back with Doug Saunders, and we'll talk urbanization and urban demographics, transformation of urban economy. I would love to have this conversation with Doug.
It's a deal. Thank you both. It's been fun. It's really very stimulating. Okay. Bless you. Bye-bye.